This is another iRaw podcast.
So the goal is to think about, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but that in these different contexts of both societal polities and place-based polities, we should be thinking about the various ways in which animals are saying yes and saying no. So they're making proposals to us to which we need to respond. We make proposals to them, and then we need to say, are they saying yes or no? And so, we're trying to think about what are the relevant kinds of contexts and procedures, institutions, but also norms that would make possible these such that these political communities become the holding environments for animals' political agency.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Animal Turn podcast. I'm delighted to bring you this bonus episode today, Animals and the Right to Politics, with Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka, both of whom have been guests on the show before and who I'm sure probably don't need any introduction. I spoke to Sue and Will in January already about their book. I read it in December. I was very excited. I was pretty keen to be one of the first out there with an interview with them, but alas, I just couldn't get things done quickly enough. Needless to say, it was a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed doing it, and I really enjoyed going back and listening to the conversation. That said, it's clear that I was very excited to be talking to them about these ideas. The speed with which I'm speaking is insane. So I'm sorry. Please bear with me, particularly in the beginning. I seem to just be going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I think that's because I am just so excited about the ideas that they bring up in their book, particularly as they relate to ideas of place-based politics. And that's kind of where I take us near the beginning of the episode to just see how they distinguish between place-based politics and societal-based politics. For now, let me just tell you a little bit about them if you don't know. Sue Donaldson is a research associate in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's University in Canada. She's also the co-convener of Animals in Philosophy, Politics, and Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, who you know is a long-time sponsor of this podcast. Sue's books include Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, and Animals and the Right to Politics, which we focus on today. She lives in the Frontenac Arch region north of Kingston with her husband Will, who's the other guest on the show, and Roxy, their amazing, wonderful dog. Then there is Will, who's the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy at Queen's University. His current research focuses on the frontiers of citizenship, and in particular on struggles to extend norms and practices of citizenship to historically excluded groups, ranging from children and people with intellectual disabilities to Indigenous peoples and animals. All of these cases challenge inherited cases of what defines attributes of the good citizen. Of course, he's done a range of work with regards to questioning and thinking about animals and politics. He's been on the show twice before, a very first guest on the show talking about animal rights, and then later also helping us to understand questions of what is politics. Today, we go deeper into, I think, those questions. And it's a wonderful conversation. I hope you feel the energy, and I hope you enjoy this episode. All right. Hi, Will and Sue. It's lovely to have you back on the show and to see you and to hear from you. Congratulations, both of you, on the book. I finished reading it this morning, so I've been working my way through it. I really so enjoyed reading it and learning from it and picking apart and finding new words and concepts that are really helpful. So I'm hoping we can talk about the main ideas of your book today, and maybe even focusing on some of these, specific concepts that you introduce. Because some of the ideas I think you have spoken about previously on the show, and some of them are pretty new. So I'm actually going to take a stab at giving an overview, a synopsis, and then we'll jump from there, and you can tell me how right or wrong I am, and we'll kind of follow from there. So in effect, you say animals have a right to politics. It's not only a question about morals, it's a question about politics. And animals actually not only have a right to politics, they currently engage in politics. And what's needed is, a legitimate acknowledgement of the fact that they do politics, as well as an enabling of that politics. And you start off saying that this is important and necessary work. And then you say other people are also doing important and necessary work, but you disagree with them in some important ways. there's the wardship model, there's the cosmopolitans, and there's the resistance model. And I'm sure we'll unpack those. But in effect, you say that they're doing interesting stuff, but sometimes they might actually be undermining the ways in which animals can do politics. And then from there, you switch to saying, okay, so we've done all the critical work, which is where a lot of us tend to stop. We tend to point at things and say, nah, you screwed up over there. And then you turn to saying, well, this is our contribution and this is what we think politics actually looks like. And this is where I think you do something really quite interesting. In many ways, I think your book is like the end of a movie. You know, everyone has the movie where the couple gets together and then they get married. And that's when the movie ends. And we think, oh, okay, there's been this big thing. Actually, you guys said, well, what happens after the marriage, right? What happens once things have continued? And you start with this idea, I guess, of a bounded politics. And then you say, okay, societies matter, memberships matter, and places matter. And you unpack how these matter and the different ways in which they manifest for a variety of animal communities. And the three, following your work with zoopolis, that you look at are domesticated animals, wild animals, and liminal animals. Is that a kind of overview of what your book achieves and is trying to do?
Yeah, that's a good way of summarizing it. Nicely done. Yeah.
That's why I did it. I just wanted everyone to be like, wow, she actually read the book. Okay, congratulations. So I want to start in the middle, if that's okay. I have a fear that often when you're interviewed about these, you always have to justify the importance of politics and the importance of agency. And I think many of the listeners already maybe know that. So if it's okay with you, I want to start in the middle with this question of societal polities and place-based polities. Could you unpack for me why the idea, why the splitting apart of these two ways of thinking about politics? And if you need to give the definition of politics before doing that, feel free to go. I'm opening it to you. Go ahead.
So we start with the inherited assumption in political theory that political communities are societal. That is, that they presuppose some kind of shared social world, and that politics is first and foremost about negotiating the terms of a shared social life. That's, if you pick up any sort of political science, political theory textbook, that's likely to be the definition on page 1, that politics is first and foremost a vehicle by which the members of a shared society negotiate and determine the terms of their scheme of social cooperation, the norms of social life, the distribution of the benefits and burdens of social life. And we think that is one really important kind of political community, that we need these societal polities, that members of a social world, in fact, have the right to, amongst themselves, steer the direction of their society. So we call those societal polities, and the criterion for being a member of a societal polity is that you're a member of that social world, that scheme of social cooperation. Okay, so that's one image of political community that is defined by sharing a social world and using politics to steer that social world. But in our relation, and in relation to those, that if we think about the social polities that humans form, one of our arguments is that domesticated animals should be seen as part of our social world, and therefore as members of these societal polities with us, and therefore as sharing steering rights in relation to this societal polity. But we also argue, and this is something that is new in the book compared to our earlier work, that there are times and places in which people who belong to different societies nonetheless share the same place. This is most clearly true when we think about the ways in which humans live on the same territory as what we call liminal animals. So, for example, urban wildlife. So if you think of just a city, the humans and the domesticated animals form a societal polity, but they share a territory with liminal animals who are not part of the social world. They're not part of the scheme of social cooperation. They may, in fact, try as much as possible to avoid interacting with humans, but we share the same place. And so we need a way of governing this shared place. We need a way of thinking about governing places that doesn't presuppose that we're all members of the same society. And so we call this a place-based polity, and we suggest that we could, so we use the term multi-species commons as our label for how to think of this. So in addition to the societal polities, and we're not trying to get rid of societal polities because members of societies have the right to steer their shared society, we should also think of ourselves as denizens. The humans, the domesticated animals, and the liminal animals are all denizens of a place-based polity, this multi-species commons. And we really quite strongly try to argue that you can't reduce one to the other. That we can't just have societal polities because then we're not going to acknowledge the need to govern the multi-species commons in a just way, but nor can we get rid of societal polities and just have place-based polities, which is one suggestion that you can see in some versions of environmental theory, that we should just get rid of societal polities and just think. So we try to make an argument that each has a role to play.
Well, what's interesting, so I mean, when people think about politics, obviously the nation state comes up, which you mention a lot in the book. And there is a conflation when thinking about the nation state of both place and society, that it's a bounded society because we belong to this nation, and the borders of the nation have been determined for us, whoever the us is. So you can see how for many folks trying to pry apart that societal and the place-based. So you're not exclusive. You're not saying that they're exclusive from one another. Someone can have a place-based polity. Actually, you can have commitments to numerous places, but you can also have commitments to numerous political communities. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the inherited concept of the nation state, when people visualize it, they visualize it both as a society. It's an American society, a Dutch society, a French society, and as a territory. And that nation states govern territories. And so, it's true that societies are emplaced. And so we need to think about what are the kind of material and ecological and environmental conditions, or the territorial bases of societal polities. But we really need, this is a crucial part of the argument, that we need to get away from the idea that nation states have exclusive jurisdiction or ownership over the territory that they currently claim, and that we should instead recognize that there are likely to be multiple political communities that have different kinds and forms of jurisdiction over different dimensions of the territory. And so it's going to be a quite complicated picture of their kind of different forms of self-government rights and shared government rights over different kinds of political community, both societal political communities and these place-based multi-species commons.
So that means that political communities is not only a matter of like my relationship to the state. So as a South African citizen, my relationship to South Africa and South African governing laws, I could belong to a range of political communities, right? So I don't know if I'm part of a church, for example, or I belong to a specific advocacy community that's engaging in, let's say, civic protests. That's a form of political engagement where I've created a political community around a specific issue or a topic. Is that the kind of multi-scalar way thinking about humans, that I could think about the multiple levels at which we practice politics, but how it also brings different places into action? So I live in Vienna and I'm upset with how the urban government is dealing with a specific animal, and I mobilize a group of people. We're responding to a spatial problem, but it's also a political problem.
Okay, so I think I need to go back and maybe give an example of the kind of thing we're talking about, because you're bringing in different kinds of sort of political identities, social groups, and that's not quite what our focus is. It's really on relations to place, territory, and jurisdictional authority in relation to places. So I think an example that we use that's helpful for getting at this. So currently, Canada is planning to build a high speed rail line that's going to connect eventually, well, Toronto to Quebec City, eventually, maybe more than that. And so this will be an east west high speed train corridor that connects a lot of the major population centers in Eastern Canada. It's very much a project, a national infrastructure project of Canada as a societal based polity, right? It's important environmentally, it's important for all kinds of reasons for Canada as a societal polity to build that high speed rail. However, that east west corridor of the rail line is going to bisect what is a crucial kind of a different territorial set of relationships. Very important for humans that live there, but mostly important for animals who live there. So in Eastern Ontario, that rail line is going to bisect probably the most important northeast green corridor in North America. So it's called the Frontenac Axis, and this is a spur basically of the Canadian Shield that connects vast wilderness areas in the north with wilderness areas in upper New York State and onto the chain of the Appalachians. So it's a crucial north-south corridor that animals already use, birds use, mammals use, reptiles and amphibians use. All kinds of animals use this corridor in part or going long distances over its length. As climate change advances, it's going to become more crucial. So it's going to be the key climate corridor in the East for animals who need to move north and south in relation to climate change. So here we have a set of relationships amongst all these animal groups and this piece of land, and it conflicts with the agenda of the Canadian state to put a train corridor through. Now, it's not that that conflict can't be overcome, but it can only be overcome if we recognize that that other place-based polity, it's not that all the animals who use that corridor are part of the same society or that they're all in a society with humans. They are all parts of their own societies, but there are a great many of them, and this geographical and ecological place is crucial for them to be able to live their lives, to do politics in their own ways, and so on. And so our project is about, okay, how do we recognize that political community, and how do we empower that political community so that this train corridor can't just be plowed through there, ignoring all of these critical relationships. They have to be fully weighted and taken into account. So it's taking away some of the powers of that national social community to recognize that they're important place-based communities, and those are more typically more local, and they need to be empowered. And so, what that might mean practically, for example, is that anywhere that train corridor is crossing the Frontenac Arch, it needs to be, have all kinds of accommodations for the animals who are moving north south. So whether that's tunnels and overpasses, other kinds of accommodations need to be fully right from the beginning as this corridor is being planned, and who it's going to serve and what we're trying to accomplish with it, and who needs to be empowered to have a say in how that works. So that would be an example of the kind of thing. So you can see that uh, both of these communities, the place-based one and the society-based one, are about a relationship to territory, but just in different ways.
And what makes this political is that they have a political claim for their space to be respected or their spatial rights to be respected. Because, I mean, people might hear this and think, okay, well, that's just a moral claim, right? Morally, it's wrong to destroy their environments. But I think what you're doing in your book is you're saying, well, it's not just that it's a matter of it's right or wrong. It's that politics requires negotiation and consideration of, I guess, different societies' claims on the same space. So is that what you're suggesting here?
Yeah. So the starting point, as you mentioned in your summary of the book, is that animals have a right to politics, and what we're trying to think of in the book is what we use the language of holding environments, because this is a term that's we found fruitful. What are the best possible holding environments for animals to exercise political agency in relation to the forces that shape their lives? And so what we're saying is that thinking of ourselves, so that humans should think of themselves not only as citizens of societal polities, but also as denizens of these multi-species commons. And that if we think of ourselves in this way, as both citizens of societal polities and denizens of multi-species commons, then we need to ask, how do we need to acknowledge that both of these polities are themselves multi-species. So they're domesticated animals who are members of our societal polity, and there are lots of non-domesticated wild animals who are members of these multi-species commons. And so we need to think about, before we can make any legitimate decisions, either as as citizens of a societal polity or as denizens of a multi-species commons, we need to think about what are our obligations to facilitate the political agency of the animals with whom we share the societal polity or the place-based polity. So what are the forms of political communication we can engage in with those animals? What are the forms of can they make proposals to us? How do we make proposals to them? Are we attentive to the ways in which they resist? So the goal is to think about, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but that in these different contexts of both societal polities and place-based polities, we should be thinking about the various ways in which animals are saying yes and saying no. So they're making proposals to us to which we need to respond. We make proposals to them, and then we need to say, are they saying yes or no? And so, we're trying to think about what are the relevant kinds of contexts and procedures, institutions, but also norms that would make possible these, such that these political communities become the holding environments for animals' political agency.
And you bring up different rights, I think, to make these arguments, okay? So so there are these two. Firstly, wait, before we go on, can you clarify for me what the difference is between polities and publics? This was a conversation I was having with someone else. What's the difference between a polity and a public?
Yeah, so a polity is, it's in some contexts they are kind of used as synonyms, but just if one tried to draw a sharper distinction between them, a polity is an entity that claims and is recognized as having certain rights to govern. So a polity, in my view, almost by definition, has and aspires to exercising collective decision-making authority and governance. The public is, particularly in the democratic tradition, having publicness is a requirement for the members of a polity, to be able to interact with each other, to make claims on each other, to learn about each other, to express their frustrations, their aspirations. So a public is it plays a particularly important role for those who want more participatory polities. one of the questions one would ask is, what's the nature of the public spaces, public institutions, public things, to use Bonnie Honeck's term, that facilitate people to participate in the decisions of the polity. But you can imagine that there are some polities, you think about kind of dictatorships run with secret police, that there is no real public. Everyone just hides from state authority. The state still it's a polity, it's governing, but there's no public that becomes the vehicle by which the members exercise participatory.
So publics are heard to some extent. They're heard. Okay, wait. So we've got governance, I guess, happening at a space in terms of territories, and we've got governance happening in terms of societies. So how places are governed and how societies are governed, and this has political implications for the groups in both, right? So it has political implications for how various groups socially organize as well as how they spatially organize. And this has, to use that classic, uneven benefits and burdens, right? So who is benefiting and who is burdening from their putting in of a new train? How are these benefits and burdens being distributed? And those are deeply political, almost at its base, asking these questions. Okay. And then we're speaking about the fact that different groups of animals and different groups of humans and different groups of humans and animals together live together as societies and live together on shared spaces. And therefore, this entitles them to specific kinds of rights. And I think that this is one of your big contributions, is you're saying, depending on which group we're looking at and depending on what kind of polity we're looking at, we're also talking about different kinds of rights. And you speak about steering rights, stewardship rights, safeguard rights, amongst others. Sue, I don't know if you want to give us an unpack of how these rights are connected.
So I'll maybe stick with the example because it's helpful to just that we've already been talking about to build on that. So if we think about that Frontenac Arch corridor, so there are various animal communities as part who live in and use that corridor. There are also different kinds of human communities. There are, of course, indigenous peoples and land claims relevant to those territories. So all kinds of overlapping social groups who are affected by anything that happens in that corridor, who live there and use that land. So the idea of the rights that attach to the political based community versus the society based community are that those various groups have shared interest and need to govern in relation to what happens to that area geographically and ecologically. They don't have a shared interest or need to govern about how each of their social communities governs its internal politics, right? So the bears who are going up and down that corridor don't need to have a voice in how humans are in towns there are organizing their police and rescue services, and the bears don't have an interest in or have any right to weigh in on how the raccoon communities govern their internal relationships and their forms of social cooperation and so on, right? So the rights that attach to these different kinds of polities, in the case of the place-based polity, we described the most significant sort of rights and interests attached to this are going to do with mobility, right? Obviously, everybody has concerns about their mobility through that corridor. It's going to be access to just the habitats and resources that various parties need in order to survive. It's going to be coordination issues, right? It's going to be things around potential conflicts about resource mobility and so on. But really, the rights attached to a place-based polity are heavily concerned with just anyone who makes their life there having a right to make their life there, and that implies certain things about their ability to move around and use the place. Whereas the societal-based polities are much more socially integrated and complex kinds of polities. So when we think instead about a town along the corridor, it's governing all kinds of dimensions of the social relations of those who are governed by that polity.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the difference.
So it's also thinking, I guess, about how the internal dynamics of the group are working. So who gets to steer, I guess, who gets to steer how that group looks and functions in future. And I guess, I mean, you do say kind of upfront that I think it's safeguard rights. Like everyone has the right to not be, this for you is the starting point. Politics is not violence. Politics is trying to find a way to not be violent and to negotiate those. So everyone has, and please correct me here because this is outside of my terrain, but so safeguard rights are the right for no one to be hurt, and we can't, that's perhaps the wrong word, to actively inflict pain and suffering should not be a goal or objective. But then as a group, whether that group is a group of raccoons or a multi-species community in a sanctuary or people living in Vienna, those people who have a invested interest in that place and in those societies should have steering rights to determine what that looks like. But then there are also intergroup conversations. So there's politics amongst ourselves as a group, and then there's politics between us and another group. And I think, I mean, you talk here, I think, primarily about the relationships with liminal animals and with wild animals. How do we negotiate with other groups that have their own politics, their own way of doing things and getting things done? And we have to find ways of respecting their ways of doing that. Is that at its most basic, is that what those rights kind of mean?
So, yes, but let me just step back and explain a bit about the background to this argument. So, you know, we're political philosophers, and so one of the eternal questions in political philosophy is what's called the boundary problem in political theory, but it's basically who should have a say over decision making. That's one version of the boundary question. And it's a hard question because political decisions tend to have very broad ranging effects over large numbers of people. And so just, you know, when the Canadian government makes a decision, it doesn't just affect Canadian citizens, it affects people around the world. And so too with every other level and form of government. And so some people have drawn the conclusion that ideally, at least, everyone who's affected by a decision should have a say in that decision. That's one argument that you get in democratic theory. And what we want to say is, and we spend quite a bit of time trying to make this case, that that's a bad principle, partly because it's impossible to know who's going to be affected by various decisions. So it's just epistemically impossible to actually operationalize. But even if you could, it's the wrong principle, because it means that the members of these social worlds would be oftentimes vulnerable to being outvoted by this much wider number of people who would be affected. So what we want to insist on is that the members of a social world, they are the ones who have the right to steer their shared society. So steering rights are limited to those who are members of societal polities. It's of course true that the decisions affect others who are not members, and we need to make sure that those impacts do not violate people's rights, do not impose unjust burdens on them, and so we need safeguards against harmful, wrongful impacts on outsiders. But that on our view, a proper democratic theory, rather than thinking that everyone who's affected has a vote, or instead we should think about the members have the right to steer. They and they alone have the right to determine the direction in which their society will move. But we need to ensure that when members exercise their steering rights, they do so within the limits set by the rights of outsiders or third parties. And those are safeguard rights. So members exercise steering rights within the limits set by safeguard rights. And we argue that way of thinking is crucial to defend meaningful self-government, both for human social groups, but also for animal social groups. That if we really went down the road of that what's called the all affected interest principle. He gave everyone who's affected by a decision a say over that decision. All sorts of animal communities would be extremely vulnerable to being outvoted by the vast diverse interests of outsiders that might have an interest in plundering their territory, dispossessing of them, of their territory, and so on. So we're quite strongly committed to the idea that we need a kind of slightly more narrow account of who has steering rights, but supplemented with a strong account of safeguard rights.
Yeah, and you spent quite a bit of time, as you say, in the first 3 chapters. I think I was particularly persuaded by your conversation around cosmopolitanism, right? Because it is a not romantic, it is an appealing idea that, everybody matters. And why wouldn't we want everybody to matter? And I really appreciate Eva Gerard's kind of her take on what comes after entanglements as well. Like it's not an easy decision. When you say everybody matters, you're not really taking account of just how uneven things are and how messy it is, and that when this is why I think there was a lot of backlash when people all started to say, like, all lives matter, when it was the Black Lives Matter movement, because it was a matter of saying, no, we need to see how a specific community is being impacted by specific political actions. And yeah, there's a kind of tendency, I think, to maybe just say, especially when it comes to animals, to just use this nature, nature becomes the catch-all phrase for all the interests there, and they get flattened, right? And the politics between different animals don't get taken into consideration, but also how difficult it actually is to think about doing politics with and letting animals do politics by themselves it's flushed away, kind of. And similarly with what you said with the wardship model, right? I was always persuaded. I always thought the wardship model sounded good. Like, at least you've got a political representative in a government speaking on behalf of animals. At the very least, you've got someone sitting there. But you said, you made a pretty convincing argument that in many ways the wardship model can actually usher in some problems where animals are not taken seriously. They're kind of reduced to what you say, the minimal animal instead of the maximal animal. So really great. I want to stick with the examples. So Sue, you have the, I think you called it the AZA Commons, right?
Yeah, so it's the A to A, Adirondack to Algonquin.
That's me not being able to read my handwriting. that's a Z and a 2, a Z and a 2 looking the same. Okay. Okay. We've got the place, we've got the societies, we've got groups inside communicating amongst themselves, and we've got groups communicating across one another. Then you bring into play these 2 concepts to try and talk about the multi-species dynamics that are going on. And on the one hand, you bring in commons, and on the other hand, you bring in agora. Now, Sue, we've spoken about agora on the show before, and I think we went down a whole different array of what constitutes agora in that episode. So I maybe want to give you a chance now to also just bring us back to what you're trying to achieve with making this distinction between agora and commons in terms of thinking about animals and their right to politics.
Okay, yes. So I'm going to switch here to talking about so I'll use Kingston as an example, which is
the Kingston Commons.
It's the Kingston Commons.
I loved it.
So Kingston is in this Frontenac Arch corridor, or on the boundary of that corridor. So I think the clearest way of thinking about the difference between the agora and the commons is to think about how a place like Kingston is both a multi-species commons and an animal agora, as we are developing those ideas. And so the members of the agora, the Kingston Agora, that's our term for the community of humans and domesticated animals who form a shared social polity there. And the idea is that the way to think of, so we've talked about these polities as being the holding environments, right, where we need to enable the politics of, enable the political participation of the members of those polities. So if we think of that animal agora, Kingston as an animal agora, how do we enable domesticated animals who, at least for now, are part of that agora? Over time, they may choose to leave and become different kinds of communities. But at least initially, we need to think of us all as being part of a shared political community, those of us who live in Kingston. So the reason we talk about the agora is that the sort of ancient ideas behind the around the agora are very much focused on politics as an activity between individuals who live in reasonable proximity, who have chances to see each other, to get to know each other. And so we use that idea because we very much think that the relevant scale of politics for animals who share a social community with humans is going to be more local. It's neighborhoods, it's towns, it's cities. It's at a scale where it's a meaningful sized space for them, which they can get to know and figure out how they want to live there and flourish there. It's a scale at which they and the humans living there can come to see who's trustworthy, who is doing what, and who they want to interact with. It's a scale at which we can. Will was talking earlier about making proposals, listening to proposals. It's a scale at which proposals can happen.
So you could think about dogs, for example, and dog parks, right? So I'm lucky in that I'm listening to you, and I've lived in Kingston, which is it's handy because I mean, obviously, so when people are thinking about domesticated animals in Kingston, there are a whole host of domesticated animals, right? There are dogs and cats, but there are also cows and chickens, and they're more invisible to people, but they are there in the city. But at the scale of which you're thinking, I mean, I could certainly see how dogs are making proposals for better dog parks in Kingston, right? Like that, there's that one dog park without any shade, and it's inundated with people and pets, right?
Yes, absolutely. And proposals vis-a-vis many other things, like why can't I go into these buildings? Why am I kept on a leash instead of being able to explore my town and meet up with my friends as I wish? And
Because that'll be quite strange for people outside of Kingston hearing. Because, like living here in Vienna, I can take Linus on the subway. I can take him into restaurants. Just yesterday, I went shopping in a shopping center with him to buy. He can't go into like a grocery store, but most places are open. Whereas in Kingston, they can't go into restaurants. He can't go on the bus. He's much more, and he's lived in both cities. He's one of those international dogs. He had a much more constrained urban experience in Kingston than he's had in Vienna in many ways, which is, yeah. Sorry, I'm derailing you here, so I keep taking you.
No,
Okay.
you're not at all. That's exactly right. So what we see is a range of that gives a sense of if dogs, say, or other domesticated animals were given greater liberty instead of being confined, were given sort of a right to make the city their own in ways that are important to them. Initially, Kingston might start looking more like Vienna, but then we could continue to push that, right? I mean, obviously, still dogs in Vienna are restricted in various ways. But the question is, we don't know. We don't know what kind of city with the dogs and cats, but also, if we think about all the currently farmed animals who will be have to be liberated from animal exploitation industries and so on, what role might they have in cities or towns? And here we sort of think of the agora in a way because of the work that we've done in sanctuaries for formerly farmed animals, like Vine Sanctuary, we sort of in our minds kind of scaling up from that kind of community where various animals from different species have come together. They're making a new kind of community, right? They're figuring out, okay, how do we want to interact? How are we sharing food and deciding what kinds of spaces we need for sleeping at night and who gets them? And how do we incorporate newcomers to this community and all kinds of things that they are making decisions about. And they're figuring that out, right? That they're not just, I mean, they all come from very different circumstances and different kinds of communities, but they are creating these new kinds of community. And we don't know what the direction of those might be, right? That's the whole point, is that what is gradually enabling these animals to be part of this shared polity in a genuine sense. So what should this city look like so that I feel like I really fully belong there? It's certainly not going to be cut carved up with all these roads with fast moving cars that pose a lethal threat. And but we could run that experiment. There's probably many things that.
Yeah, and I think you rightly point out that there's many of these micro experiments currently happening in cities, right? Like playing with design, figuring out ways to have animals have more mobility and freedom. So this is an example of the domesticated animals having more legitimate steering rights, right?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And so then if we think about, well, what is the multi-species commons in relation to Kingston? Then I think we're, first of all, so now we're thinking about all the animals who don't want to be with humans in restaurants, or going on city buses with them, or participating in various kinds of maybe social services of the city, and so on. So again, going back to the idea of a place-based polity for the liminal animals there, what's really important is that they can lead their social lives the way they want to in this space. And that involves lots of coordination with the humans and domesticated animals about mobility, about access to resources, and so on. And so, first of all, if we think about that Kingston Commons geographically, it looks a little different than Kingston as a societal polity. The societal polity is really geographically, we could think of that as where humans and domesticated animals live, where their residences are, right? And that sort of gives you the boundaries of a community. With the liminal animals, many of them are moving in and out of the city. So a key mobility consideration is whether they can use the river systems and the lakes and green corridors to move in and out of the city the way they need to do to live their life worlds. For example, in Kingston, there's a huge multi-lane highway at the north end of the city that is a major barrier for animals trying to move sort of into the adjacent countryside and so on. So so first of all, geographically, it looks a little bit different because the if we think about the relevant community now, it includes all these animals who are, yeah, moving through Kingston, but not necessarily always kind of residing in Kingston. And then we're thinking about different sets of needs and concerns that the various members of that commons have, and need to address together. And
So like the squirrels, right?
yeah, so like the squirrels needing to get around Kingston currently use like telegraph wires and so on.
I've never seen that anywhere else. I mean, I keep an eye open for it, but squirrels, like the speed and the dexterity they have of navigating Kingston above the ground, right? Like they've got their own highways. They've literally mobilized Kingston's infrastructure to their own purposes. Not always. I mean, I've also seen several of them being electrocuted as a result, right?
No, that's exactly right. So that those they have to use those. If they don't, they get run over by cars, right? And a lot of them do get run over by cars. So they use what's there, but it's not far from ideal. Like I mean, they were very dexterous, which is why they can actually use those wires to cross roads. But they, as you say, they get electrocuted, they fall, other things happen. And so, what would a corridor that actually they would have a role in designing look like? And how would we go about doing that? Well, we might try out different, different kind. Like first, we might observe where they actually want to go in the city, and so how they get from a large green space where they nest to important water sources or to black walnut trees, that are an important source of food. Then we might consider, okay, well, what would a safe corridor look like for them to move around the city? How do we imagine Kingston as it appears to the different squirrel communities, what they're trying to accomplish, what resources and mobility are important for them, and what might a proposal look like that actually addresses that?
Would these then be that? Okay, so you've got the agora and the commons, and you can almost imagine them being mapped onto one another, but they map onto whatever the idea, the imaginary of Kingston is. They map slightly differently they bring up about different political imaginaries, right? Because they bring different groups into focus. And so we've got, let's just for ease, we've got the dogs in the agora and we've got the squirrels in the commons, right? And the dogs in the agora are making some proposals that they would like to go into restaurants and not be leashed so much. And the squirrels in the commons are making proposals that they would like to have safer mobility routes through the city. Okay, now those on the surface end up sounding quite similar, but you're saying that the dogs are making proposals about how society should function and the level at which they should be integrated into political decision-making of Kingston, as a society and as a place, I suppose. Whereas the squirrels don't get much of a say in, is this more a matter of safeguarding squirrels? They're here and they need to be protected. How are those two then different to one another if both of them are making proposals? Like what's the other than one being a liminal animal and the other being a domesticated animal, what's the difference there?
So the idea of the commons. So we spend quite a bit of time discussing the concept of the commons and why we think it's a really important concept for thinking about our relations with liminal animals, but that it's important to also understand that the commons is quite a thin conception of political community. It doesn't have the same aspirations. So with societal polities, the goal is when the dogs and the humans are exercising their steering rights about a societal polity, we're imagining that's the vehicle for the pursuit of people's, broadest political ambitions about how to engage in world building. That societal politics is the vehicle by which members try to really reshape the world in the image that they want of the future they kind of want to lead. When it comes to the commons, we need to start from the assumption that there are fundamentally that the denizens of the commons have fundamentally different and often competing conceptions of the world they want to live in.
I was just going to add sort of some concrete examples again. If we think about the agora, the societal polity that we share with domesticated animals, questions that we might be asking, like from the ground up. Well, what does social systems look like in the city? Like what is the healthcare system? And if you were doing that, from the ground up with animals as part of the discussion, what would a kind of One Health concept say? We would be involved in each other's in those kinds of care relations of taking care of health, taking care of our food supply together, and so on. And so how would we design those systems with domesticated animals from the ground up? Or how would we create new kinds of, like you mentioned the dog parks earlier, how would we reimagine with domesticated animals from the ground up what our world of interaction would look like, new kinds of places and objects for us to play together or to create together, and to design a city together that reflects the kind of community we want to be. So these are very sort of much more positively focused kind of visions of a shared world. But I don't think it would be appropriate to be asking those questions in relation to liminal animals. I think largely, they have their own care networks. They have their own knowledge and ways of organizing their food systems. They have their own projects. And we're not trying to integrate all of those projects together.
You're not trying to get squirrels into the coffee shops. Squirrels have no interest in being in the coffee shops, and that would, I guess. Okay, so this is really, 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 really interesting. Okay, so you've got. Then becomes a question of resources, right? So where are the expectations lying when it comes to sustaining the agora and sustaining the commons? Because if we are building an agora together, then that will mean that we need to think about how our resources are being used, and those resources are not exclusively for humans. Even now, right, like which humans get which resources how is deeply political, and how those are distributed is a bone of contention. But we're saying, well, animals also, like you say, there's questions of healthcare, and there's questions of mobility needs of different animals that have been part of our societies for thousands of years, and they're deserving of more. Really, they're deserving of more of the resources that we have as a society. End of story. But now let's say we do notice that the squirrels are struggling, and now Kingston says, well, how on earth, why must our citizens put money towards their own community? They have no interest in our future. Why should we I mean, yes, I respect that they do politics by themselves. They've got their own politics. We respect that. But why is there any onus on, let's say, the government of Kingston? Or am I just making a mistake here by bringing politics back to main governance structures? What's the onus on the city to respond to their needs?
I mean, there's a lot in that question. So one aspect of that question is, I mean, it's absolutely true that the model that we're proposing requires humans to share more with animals and to restrain our, that humans have tended to be just have these voracious appetites to take over land, to take over resources in ways that are devastating for many animals on the planet. So in the very final chapter of the book, we confront the question, is it realistic to ask or expect humans to bear the costs involved in justice for animals, and both in relation to domesticated animals, so giving up on factory farming, and but also in relation to the liminal animals or wild animals. We need to restrain our tendencies to take over their territories or to govern in ways that ignore their interests and impose costs on them. What we try to argue in that final chapter is that many of these costs, so first of all, we just acknowledge that there's going to be, that this involves costs for humans. But on the one hand, we argue that many of these costs are transitional. It's going to be like that it's going to be an adjustment to move towards the image that we suggest, but that once we get through a kind of transition phase, people will just, there's all sorts of ways in which the image that we suggest about being denizens of place-based polities and citizens of animal corridors, that these offer all sorts of opportunities for humans to lead good lives. That we're not condemning people to. We actually think that humans would, that there's all sorts of exciting possibilities for ways of living together justly with animals that would be enriching and fun and exciting and not just deprivation. So that's part of our answer. But the other part of the answer is that the status quo is totally unsustainable. I mean, everyone knows this. And so
I like that you call it utopic. That sticking to the status quo is actually anyway.
Yeah, it's the fantasy. It's the
fantasy. That's what you said. Yeah.
And so, and that's both environmentally, in terms of, there's also economic costs, there's psychological cost, that in order to try to cling to this existing animal industrial complex, we're imposing all sorts of burdens on ourselves and on the world and on our politics. And so our hope in that final chapter is that when you really think seriously about what a price we're paying to desperately cling to the status quo, and then you think about all the exciting opportunities for new forms of flourishing that would emerge, that we hope that people will find it inspiring and motivating, and not just that they dread it as just deprivation or denial.
Yeah, I mean, to sum it up, something's got to change, right? Something's got to change, and and I think, like you say, there are many arguments. Once you start to just put aside the economic demands and the demands to make profit and to sustain property and asset relations, you start to say, well, I think many of us would benefit from moving slower and having better senses of community, both with humans and with other animals. So I have 3 other questions that I'd like to get to before we go to your quotes. The one is, sorry to bring us back to the commons again, but it was something that nagged at me a little bit while reading the book. And that was, I know that you've spoken about a multi-species commons before in reference to the sanctuaries, right? But yet the idea of the commons in the book seemed different. And I just wanted to maybe, because it wasn't something that you really addressed in the book, and I don't know if that's something you want to speak to here, that maybe you're bringing in some kind of concept confusion, because it seems to me, based on what you've just said here, that what's happening in the sanctuaries is probably closer to an agora than a commons. They're both nodding. They're both nodding ferociously at me.
Yes, you are absolutely right. So when we used the multi-species commons so that was in a paper in relation to vine sanctuary. That was before we had sort of fully developed this distinction between societal and place-based polities. And we were sort of, it's kind of actually fudged in that, because vine sanctuary, again, is both. It's an agora and a multi-species community, as we would describe it. One is the community of the rescued, formerly farmed animals and their relationships with the humans there, which are much denser, involve a lot more sort of, rules about interaction, a lot more care practices, all of that kind of thing. But it also is very much a what we would call a multi-species commons, because there's many liminal animals who come in and out of the sanctuary, and they're an important part of sanctuary life, understood as a commons. So yes, that's very confusing, and you are exactly right. And so now what we're trying to use multi-species commons as this political relationship that happens in a place-based polity, agora as this political relationship that unfolds in a societal-based polity.
Okay. That's really helpful. You almost need like a catch-all for all of them. I guess that's the politics for it. But I mean, it's always useful to pry them apart because different relationships are happening. And so the second question I had then is, fine, we've spent a lot of time now speaking about domesticated animals doing politics with humans and possibly eventually leaving humans and going off to do politics on their own. That's up to them. We've got liminal animals that are doing politics for themselves, but sometimes we're having to navigate relationships with humans in shared spaces, for example. But I realized that we haven't really touched on wild animals here, right? So wild animals is the third kind of big group of animals that you speak about, and this brings in a different spatial imaginary and a political imaginary. So I thought maybe we could just spend a spot of time talking about that without losing, I don't want to lose sight of wild animals are an important part of the project as well.
So we distinguish, just for kind of as a heuristic, these two different types of non-domesticated animals, liminal animals and what we sometimes call truly wild animals or wilderness animals. And the distinction is based on the level of entanglement with humans and human settlement. So if these non-domesticated animals are living in areas of human settlement, we call them liminal animals. But if they live on their own territory away from humans, and if they typically try to avoid contact with humans, then we call them wild animals, or truly wild animals, or wilderness animals. But the point is that they're living on their own habitat, their own territory, which has not yet at least been colonized by humans. And so in relation to those, so our one thing we claim is that there are still such animals, that there's some of the people in animal studies argue that humans have so completely colonized the earth that there's no longer useful to think about there being such things as wild animal territories. But we just think that's wrong. There are still places of the world that should be seen as belonging to the animals that live there and that have not yet been colonized by humans. So then the question is, how do we enable their right to politics? And our suggestion is, on the one hand, so they form their own social groups, pods, herds, flocks, and so on. And they have rights to govern themselves through their own societal polities. And they also form their own kind of multi-species collectives. So there's lots of different species of wild animals in these wild animal territories. But that's basically all politics they do on their own. And then the question is, what's their relationship to humans? And here our suggestion is that we might we should think of our relations with them as international relations. And one of the traditions of international relations is diplomacy. And there's been a lot of work recently about why it might be useful to think of our relations with wild animals as a form of diplomacy. So we're not trying to integrate them into our society. They are separate and self-governing societies with whom we can enter into some kind of diplomatic relations. And so one version of that idea it has emerged, can be found in some strands of indigenous thought, particularly some of the indigenous traditions here in North America, which have a long tradition of thinking about having treaties with wild animal societies. So they might have a deer treaty or a buffalo treaty, or various kinds of fish treaties. So that this idea, so this is sometimes the idea of treaty diplomacy, that one tries to think about good relations with wild animals by thinking about what would be the terms of treaty diplomacy. And that's a treaty that would need to be continually renewed and updated, particularly given things like climate change. But so our suggestion is to think about our relations with wild animals in the form of treaty diplomacy, and then to think about how that can be injected into existing political structures. So what would be the spaces in the international system? What would be the spaces to inject ideas and practices of treaty diplomacy? And so we look at ideas of federalism, and of interstitial federalism is a way of trying to identify spaces and places within the structure of international law and international politics to inject ideas of treaty diplomacy. We also look at some practices of conservation and how we think of various kinds of conservation models that often involve setting aside, designating territories as conservation lands, how that could be strengthened by thinking of it through a form of treaty diplomacy that guarantees wild animals' right to politics. We also look at the rights of nature movement. And so all of these so what we try to do in that chapter is identify a series of developments that we think are actually already taking place, what we argue is they implicitly gesture in the direction of a right to politics for wild animals. We think there are movements afoot. People recognize that if we're going to avoid this massive extinction of all the wild animals on the planet, we need to somehow affirm wild animals' right to politics. And there are these movements like rights of nature, like conservation, that we think kind of gesture in that direction. And we try to show how a more explicit commitment to the idea of self-government rights for wild animals and how ideas of treaty diplomacy can help make those more effective.
Yeah. So in essence, I mean, it's almost the imaginary of out there, which obviously has its own problematics, because to have that idea of wild animals out there, you can think that, they're somewhere else doing something else and of no concern, but they are of concern because these lands are diminishing. And you've got more animals that were once, to use your words, completely and truly wild, increasingly becoming liminal because there is just no other land out there anymore, right? So they're entering or switching from perhaps wild to liminal, even though that's not necessarily, they're not synanthropic in the way, let's say, a raccoon or a squirrel is. They just simply don't have other options. But so you've got the agora, you've got the commons, and you've got a kind of idea of out there and trying to create more out there and respecting. It's not a very elegant word, and the idea of trying to, I guess, safeguard. I'm trying to use your words here again, but like to say that their space is theirs and they have a right to determine how it functions. And maybe to bring another example, so we had the dogs and the squirrels in Kingston, and as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about koalas in Australia, right? So koalas in Australia rely on blue gum forests. And I had Danielle Claude on the show like 2 years ago, and her book, in effect, spoke about how they're very picky eaters. All they eat are the eucalyptus, right? And they're also quite individual in many ways, but they leave loads of scent markings on trees. And in this way, they navigate their own politics amongst one another and their own social relations. But because eucalyptus forests are increasingly fragmented, being made smaller, being more further apart and spread out, not only because of human actions, but also because of increasing levels of forest fires, etc., there's a rise of koalas in cities, right? So now you're starting to have city officials having to respond and think about how you can respond to koalas. It points to me that a political move that would be useful for Australia as Australia, but also as an international relationship with koalas, would be the preservation of those eucalyptus, right? Instead of trying to now respond to or only respond to the fact that the animals are moving into their city, it's to see that movement of them into the city as an international crisis, right? Like there is a crisis happening where there is a lack of land. And I know that's not an example from your book. I'm just kind of running with koalas at the moment.
No, that's a really nice example, though, because I think it's a really good illustration of why projects to not just conserve existing eucalyptus forests, but to bridge them, to build corridors between them, to just try and preserve and extend that as a viable world in which koalas can be engaging in politics there on their own terms. But politics on their own terms might change for koalas, or might change for some koalas. So it's not either or, right? So humans have already created this situation where some koalas are moving into cities, and so now we have some liminal populations of koalas, and who knows if those even if the eucalyptus forests were allowed to regrow and reconnect, would those koalas choose to go back? Or would some of them decide that they actually, they like city life, they form new kinds of koala communities
Cultures,
instead of
communities, yeah.
cultures? Exactly. So it's not like these are models that everybody has to fit into. They're starting points for thinking about relationships, and those relationships are open. And the whole point is that animals be self-determining in those relationships, right? And so again, it could go in so many different directions.
But it's amazing because it raises the question of, is just a simple relocation, because that's often how animals who are displaced are treated. Well, we'll replace this and we'll just pick them up and we'll put them back there, which is a denial of their politics, their culture, etc. So, I really appreciate throughout your work that you're not speaking at a species level, which I know there's a tendency to want to conflate, but the talk of groups or flocks or communities, and that you can blend between, right? Like you mentioned bears earlier. One could imagine circus bears that are not fitting in that wild animal category, but are probably more akin to liminal, possibly even dipping a bit into domesticated animals, even though they haven't been bred over generations, because they are reliant on and have had no choice in the matter, right? So I think the model, when you try to suspend a little bit the kind of conflation of species and of our imaginations of wild, domesticated, and liminal, they become really fruitful. Okay, I know that we are very fast approaching. I had one final question about just, I think, a contribution that your book really makes, and that's, I think, sometimes we try to avoid talking about because it's tricky terrain, is your discussion about Indigenous knowledges. So I just wanted to maybe touch on that, well, Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous land movements, to say that oftentimes kind of animal rights is pitted against Indigenous movements in a way that's perhaps not helpful, and from both, there's a whole bunch going on, and I haven't really even figured out how to talk about it myself, but I was really convinced in your book how you're saying that in many ways the claims and the discussions you're having about politics with animals would be an important discussion to also have in thinking about colonization. Yeah, I just wanted to open it up there as a final kind of thought on why you think bringing these into the same frame is important.
Yeah, so there is, the background is there is this tense, conflicted relationship between animal rights advocacy and Indigenous rights. They got off on the wrong foot many, many years ago, and particularly in the Canadian context, for a variety of somewhat accidental reasons. The first real kind of animal rights campaign in Canada was against the seals, the seal hunt, and that, I mean, which had a connection with Indigenous rights that people hadn't thought through, and it was just unfortunate that set in motion a kind of tense relationship. But against that background, we think the idea of animal politics and the idea that animals have a right to politics is actually a potential source of clear compatibility and synergy with many Indigenous views. So it's absolutely clear. I mean, there's many different Indigenous traditions for thinking about animals and human relations with animals. But on virtually all of them that I've read about, they take as just given that animals have a right to politics. And so it's a kind of surprising idea for those who were trained in the Western tradition. But for many Indigenous peoples, if you ask if animals have a right to politics, they say, of course, that's just self-evident. And so, and as I said, and so not surprisingly, since many Indigenous societies and cultures have started from an assumption that animals have a right to politics, they have thought through. There are concepts available in those traditions that we can learn from, and so we take this idea of treaty diplomacy as an example. That it's the kind of thing that one would expect. It's where societies have for millennia thought about animals having a right to politics, and it's likely that they have good ideas for how we can conceptualize it. And then we also argue that Indigenous struggles to reclaim self-government rights and land back movements are interesting and important contexts for thinking about animals' right to politics. And so, for example, there, as part of Indigenous land claims, there are efforts for Indigenous people to have a greater say in the governing of national parks. So many national parks were built by dispossessing Indigenous peoples and then calling it a national park. And Indigenous peoples rightly are reclaiming authority in relation to those national parks. And so we suggest that this, like what we see here, is an interesting and evolving. These are interesting contexts in which ideas of conservation are like, these national parks are sites for evolving ideas of conservation. They're sites for evolving ideas of Indigenous self-determination, but they're also sites for, we suggest, for evolving ideas about animals' right to politics. And that, rather than starting from the assumption that these are fundamentally there's tensions between all of these, that the animal rights agenda is not exactly equivalent to the conservation agenda, which is not exactly equivalent to Indigenous land back, but there are openings here, and a lot of people are interested in exploring ways of trying to see synergies as well as conflicts between these. And so too with the rights of nature. And yeah, so that's, we try to, in the chapter on wild animals, highlight how we can see some interesting convergences in these projects.
And also, sorry, I just wanted to add there that it's important for animal rights people who say start with a kind of foundational idea of a right to life and a right not to be harmed and so on, that it's important that they not simply reject or stay out of these conversations about decolonization, about conservation and so on, because that premise isn't shared across those groups, and it isn't. But we can still be part of a conversation that is focused, as Will said, more at this level of, well, what does a right to politics look like? And what dimensions of that can we reach maybe some compromises or agreements about, even though some of our, we're coming from very different places and some of our foundational premises might look quite different.
It's also doing politics, I suppose. Like it's not a zero-sum game of this is right and that is wrong. And that's what makes, I guess, conversations about political philosophy very different to conversations about moral philosophy, is we have to navigate these tensions and find productive means of doing so. thank you so much. I think we've touched a lot of what's happened and moved in your book. And I know we didn't get into the capacity contract and into minimal animal, which you use as the foundation of what you are pushing back against. But I think you've shown throughout the conversation here today that it's an embrace of animals at the maximum, right? What you say, the maximal animal. Animals are complex, depends on the animal, depends where you're looking, but so are humans, and we have to appreciate that complexity and take it seriously and find ways to legitimize, I suppose, these relations. So thank you so much for your work. I've got a feeling it's going to have ripple effects and a lot of people are going to have things to say. So thank you. Why don't we switch to your quotes now? I don't know if you have a shared quote or one each.
I think we have one quote. Let me first say, Claudia, I'm really glad that you started the conversation the way you did. You said rather than starting at the front end of the book, sort of to start. And I really appreciate the conversation that emerged from that because, yeah, but it's nice because sometimes, yeah, it's hard to get beyond the first part of the book. So thank you. And the quote we've chosen is from it's actually an older article from 1999 by Jim Chaney and Anthony Weston. And this is a quote that we use in the introduction to the book. And it's from an article of theirs called Environmental Ethics as Environmental Etiquette. And it sort of gets to the ideas that we have about, what is the holding environment, first of all, for animal politics to happen? And how do we create that openness for animals to reveal, you know, how they want to live with us, if they do, what kinds of worlds they want to create with us or not with us. So they're concerned that a lot of thinking about animals starts from needing to know, making determinations about animal characteristics and capacities. And once we have that pinned down, then we know the correct way to treat them. And instead, they're suggesting a very different starting place. So anyway, so here's the quote. So the whole idea is that, we must first know what animals are capable of and then decide on that basis whether and how we are to consider them ethically. On the alternative view, we will have no idea of what other animals are actually capable of. We will not readily understand them until we already have approached them ethically. That is, until we have offered them the space and time, the occasion, and the acknowledgement necessary to enter into relationship with us. Ethics must come first.
But don't you want to say politics must come first?
I think their ethics there is politics, but
So I think you should reread that sentence about offer, like what it that it's true they describe it as ethics, but what they say is that we need to offer. So do you have it there, Sue?
Yep. On the alternative view, we will have no idea of what other animals are actually capable of. We will not readily understand them until we already have approached them ethically. That is, until we have offered them the space and time, the occasion, and the acknowledgement necessary to enter into relationship.
Yeah. So space, time, and opportunity and acknowledgement, like those, we think are political. That if you ask, what would it mean to ensure that animals have the space? What is it to ensure that they have time, that they'd have the acknowledgement? These are not things that an individual, a private individual can do on their own. It's that one way to think about that quote, or the way we think about that quote, is that it's calling on society, calling on us collectively to ask what would be the conditions. What we're calling the hold. So our interpretation of that quote is we're not going to know what animals are capable of until we create the holding environment in which they can express themselves, and that's a deeply political on our.
Mm. And politics and ethics are obviously connected. I was just taking a stab, but this is what you speak about at the end of your book. I think you guys are very, you're not presupposing anything. You're saying that this is a space. We haven't done this really, and we've done it in very minimal ways. If you want to talk about minimal anything, the interactions here have been minimal, relatively superficial, and they haven't been ambitious. And there is a lot of scope to be ambitious and to experiment with this. And maybe it's high time that we get a little bit more experimental our resources and with our time and with our space. And I think that that's a very political thing in and of itself. Holding environment does sound a bit static, though, doesn't it? I mean, the person you're relying on for holding environments, it's a pretty dynamic concept, I'm assuming, right? I did go and read Hanig's work after engaging with your stuff, and I love the idea of public things, but I didn't get to, like, holding environments. It's a dynamic concept, right? It's not as though, because as a geographer, I'm thinking about like a container. Here's a holding environment and I put the things in it and it will do fine. It's how do you create the conditions for the good to happen, I suppose.
Absolutely. It's dynamic. So individuals come to be who they are in a holding environment with others. And part of what they are together is shaping and changing their holding environment together, right? So very dynamic.
Yeah, so it's important. It may be useful to the concept is that the concept of the holding environment is not that the environment constrains us or boxes us in, but rather that there are various features of our surroundings that are the bearers and holders of our subjectivity. And so the thought is that no one, human or non-human, is capable of, we're not self-sufficient. We don't hold everything of value inside our brains, that we continually rely on the social environment and the material environment to remind us who we are, to be, as I say, to be the bearers and holders of our identities and agencies and affiliations. And so, yeah, this is deeply dynamic, but it's about...
It's affirming almost, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a way of, and it's not something that's necessarily conscious. I think you highlight that in the beginning, like how you move through the street, the extent to which you feel safe or unsafe, the ways in which you be or are and understand yourself and others is part of this environment, right? And I guess a holding environment is one concept to kind of conceptual move to try and bring that together. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your work, for all of this. It's a lot to take in, but it's really awesome. And I've already got like 5 million ideas. So as always, thank you. Of course, everyone's asking you what's next. So this is, after Zoopolis and you've dropped this, are you going to continue working on some of these ideas, or is there a change of pace or focus? What's your plan, guys? What's your plan?
We're not quite sure. I mean, I think for a long time we had the idea that there would be a follow-up to Zoopolis, but I don't think at this point that we're thinking, like, I think this is, yeah, we try to give it our best shot here. And I don't see that, we have a kind of clear sort of follow-up agenda. Obviously, there's lots, as you say, like there's actually quite a bit going on in the book. It's fairly dense. Like we might pull out different threads of that and try and explore them a little more carefully. But yeah, no animal book plans at this stage.
Well, I'm sure people will be chewing on this for a while, so I think that's totally fine. And Will, how about you?
We hope that the book will inspire people to develop, to challenge, to refine, to modify, and that this conversation will continue. And I mean, I sort of hope that it'll continue both at a more conceptual level, but how do we make these ideas of the right to politics and holding environments and denizenship and commons and agora, I hope people will find these theoretical ideas fertile and will continue development, but also, we've been quite pleasantly surprised about the number of people who have been inspired by our work to actually try some experiments on the ground in various ways, including in the arts, in planning and in education. And so we, if that continues, we'd obviously be thrilled if there are ways that we can contribute to experiments in actually trying to implement these ideas. So we are part of a range of networks that are continuing to work on these issues, and we're keen to participate. We just haven't decided on the exact modality.
I think if you were to stop today, people would be like, that's fine. Like, you guys have done so much, and you've created communities and spaces. I know, I'm very thankful for you personally as someone who I've gotten to know and play pool against, Will. Thank you for everything you've done, for mobilizing people and communities of people to think about these ideas, but also for putting in the time and for living in line with the things you say. So I'm thankful to know you, and I appreciate you being on the show. And thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today.
Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah.
This is lots of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you to Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka for being amazing guests, and for, creating the book, but also for sharing so generously with their thoughts and ideas in this episode here today. Thank you also to Rebecca Shen, Christian Mentz, and Harry de Bont, who do some work behind the scenes at the Animal Turn. And of course, thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring this podcast. This episode was hosted and produced by myself. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hüttenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.